I worked for a millionaire for 11 years, but never imagined what he whispered before dying. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel to keep listening to real stories and secrets that few dare to tell. My name is Grace Holloway, and for 11 long years, I was the private nurse and caregiver for Arthur Langston. Some of you may recognize the name, others may not, but for those who do, you know exactly the kind of man he was, or at least you think you do. What you saw on TV, in magazines, in those overproduced interviews where he smiled for the cameras, that wasn't the Arthur I knew. Not even close. I first stepped into the Langston mansion on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I remember it like it was yesterday because I almost turned around and left before I even crossed the threshold. The house was enormous, cold, and intimidating. Columns as tall as trees framed the entrance, and the front doors were made of dark oak, carved with patterns that looked more like warnings than decorations. Inside, everything smelled of old wood, leather, and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like blood lingering in the air even though I couldn't see a trace of it. Back then, I was just another name on a long list of nurses the agency had sent over. Arthur had already burned through more than a dozen of them in less than 2 years. Some quit after a few days. Others didn't even make it through a full shift. Word traveled fast in the home care community. Arthur Langston was a nightmare client. Difficult, demanding, verbally abusive. And if you had any sense of self-respect, you stayed far away. But I needed the job. My mother was sick at the time, medical bills were piling up, and I couldn't afford to be picky. So I took the assignment, thinking maybe they were exaggerating. Maybe the man was just old and cranky like so many others I had cared for. I was wrong. Arthur Langston wasn't just cranky. He was cruel. The kind of cruel that doesn't come from old age or illness, but from something rotten deep inside a person's core. He had this way of looking at you, like you were dirt beneath his shoes, like your existence was a personal inconvenience to him. On my very first day, I found that out the hard way. I walked into his bedroom, introduced myself politely, and asked if he needed anything. Without even turning to look at me, he muttered, "Another disposable idiot. Let's see how long you last." That was my welcome. Over the next few weeks, I learned quickly how to navigate his moods. There were days when he refused to speak at all, staring out the window for hours as if waiting for something, or someone, who would never arrive. Other days, he'd unleash a storm of insults over the smallest things. The temperature of his soup, the angle of his pillow, the way I folded his blankets. I remember once, during a particularly rough night, I accidentally knocked over a glass of water on his bedside table. He didn't yell. No. Arthur was too calculated for that. Instead, he looked me straight in the eye, smiled, this cold, eerie smile, and said, "You're lucky I'm too old to get out of this bed. Years ago, I would have dragged you out of my house by your hair." That's the kind of man he was. And yet, I stayed. For 11 years. Why? That's a question I've asked myself more times than I can count. Part of it was the money, sure. Arthur paid well. Very well. More than double what other home care jobs offered. But it wasn't just that. Somewhere along the way, I think, I started to feel sorry for him. There's something that happens when you care for someone that closely, for that long. You see them at their most vulnerable. You see the fear behind the anger, the weakness behind the cruelty. There were nights when I would find him sitting up in bed, staring at the ceiling with tears in his eyes, whispering things I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes he would call out for names I didn't recognize. Other times he would mutter what sounded like apologies, though never to me. Then, there were the hospital runs. Arthur's health was a roller coaster. Heart issues, kidney problems, blood pressure spikes. I spent more nights in emergency rooms with him than I care to remember. And every single time when the doctors told him he'd pulled through yet again, he'd sneer at me like I had something to do with his stubborn refusal to die. But there were moments, fleeting moments, when I almost believed there was a human being buried somewhere under all that bitterness. One winter evening, after he'd just returned from another hospital stay, I found him in the living room staring at an old photograph. It was of a young woman, beautiful, with dark hair and sharp eyes that looked almost too intelligent for her own good. The frame was worn, the glass cracked. I stood there for a minute, unsure whether to interrupt him or leave him alone. Finally, he spoke. "She had her mother's temper," he said, voice distant, almost hollow. When I asked who she was, he didn't answer. He just placed the photo face down on the table and wheeled himself back to his bedroom. It wasn't the first time I'd seen that photograph, but it was the first and only time he ever mentioned it out loud. Looking back now, I realized that moment was more important than I knew. The mansion itself added to the atmosphere. It was massive, filled with dark hallways and closed doors. Whole sections of the house sat unused, covered in dust and cobwebs like frozen snapshots from decades past. I wasn't allowed to clean certain rooms. Arthur was very clear about that. "No one goes in there," he'd growl if I even walked near one of the locked doors. There was one room on the second floor that he was especially protective of. The door had a heavy brass lock, and the key never left his pocket. Once, out of pure curiosity, I asked him what was inside. He didn't even answer. Just gave me a look. The kind of look that made your stomach turn cold. The staff, what little of it remained, kept their distance. The housekeeper, Margaret, had been with the family for over 20 years, but she rarely spoke unless necessary. The groundskeeper, Carl, was a quiet man who mostly kept to himself, spending hours tending the gardens, especially the rose garden out back. That garden was Arthur's pride and joy. Even on his worst days, he would demand to be wheeled outside just to sit among the roses, breathing in the scent like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. Funny, isn't it? How something so beautiful could be part of something so monstrous. Over time, I became numb to the insults, the threats, the manipulation. I did my job, administered his medications, changed his dressings, managed his diet, listened to his endless tirades about incompetent doctors and greedy relatives. I learned to read his moods like weather patterns, knowing exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. And yet, despite everything, there was a part of me that grew attached, not to the man, but to the routine, the familiarity. Even the dysfunction became something I understood, something I could predict, until his final year. That's when everything started to change. The anger shifted into something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on at first. He grew more restless, more paranoid. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, whispering under his breath. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the ceiling for hours, as if expecting it to collapse on top of him. Once, when I walked in to check on him, I found him clutching that same photograph again, rocking back and forth like a frightened child. "Do you hear them, Grace?" he asked me one night, eyes wide and trembling. "They're in the walls. She's in the walls." I told myself it was just his mind slipping. Old age, illness, maybe dementia finally settling in. But deep down, I knew it was something more. And I was right. Because on the night Arthur Langston died, he said something to me, something I can't unhear, something that changed everything I thought I knew about the man behind the mansion. The last year of Arthur Langston's life wasn't like the years before. It was worse. Much worse. By that point, I knew his routines better than I knew my own. I could predict his outbursts, time his medications down to the minute, and recognize the exact tilt of his brow that meant he was about to insult me. But as that year dragged on, something shifted. Something dark started seeping out of him, like poison leaking from a cracked container. His health had always been fragile, but suddenly it was deteriorating faster than I could manage. His heart was failing. His kidneys were barely functioning. His skin turned grayish, almost ashen. There were days I'd check his pulse 3 or 4 times just to make sure he was still alive. And then there were the nights. The sleepless, endless nights. At first, it started small. Little things. I'd come into his room at midnight to check his oxygen levels and find him awake, staring at the ceiling fan like it held the answer to a question he was too afraid to ask. His eyes wide, glassy, unblinking. When I'd speak his name, he wouldn't respond right away. Sometimes not at all. I caught him whispering once. It was soft, barely audible over the hum of the machines. I thought he was talking in his sleep, but when I leaned in to listen, I realized his eyes were open, and he was crying. I froze in the doorway, unsure what to do. This was Arthur Langston, the man who'd spent over a decade making me feel like less than dirt. The same man who once told me that tears were for weak people and women with nothing better to do. Yet there he was, tears running down his wrinkled face, dripping onto his pillow as he mouthed words I couldn't make out. I should have comforted him. I know that. It's what a good nurse would do. But in that moment, I just stood there, watching, too shocked to move, too confused to speak. Over the next few weeks, the episodes became more frequent. Sometimes I'd find him muttering to himself in the middle of the day, rocking slightly in his chair. Other times, he'd sit completely still for hours, as if holding his breath, eyes darting back and forth like he was tracking something invisible crawling along the walls. The worst was the ceiling. It became an obsession for him. I don't know what he thought he saw up there, but he'd spend entire nights staring at it, unblinking, almost catatonic. I'd try to redirect him, turning his head gently, encouraging him to sleep, but the moment I let go, his gaze would drift right back up. One night, I walked in to find him pointing at a specific spot above his bed. "There," he said in a broken whisper. "That's where it started." I asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer. He just shook his head, shut his eyes tight, and refused to speak for the rest of the night. Margaret, the housekeeper, started noticing it too. She didn't say much. She never did. But one morning, as I was refilling Arthur's pill organizer, she caught my eye and muttered, "He's talking to someone who isn't there." I wanted to laugh it off, but I couldn't, because I was beginning to hear things too. Late at night, when I'd sit outside his room with a book, trying to stay awake for the inevitable emergency call, I'd hear him talking. Low, frantic whispers that grew faster and more desperate the longer they went on. At first, I thought he was just reliving arguments or business meetings in his head. After all, the man lived his whole life manipulating people and making deals that destroyed others. Maybe the guilt was finally catching up to him in his sleep. But the tone was different. There was fear. Real, bone-deep fear. One particular night stands out in my memory like a bad dream I can't shake. It was around 3 a.m. I had drifted off in the hallway chair when a noise jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was one of the machines, maybe the oxygen monitor. But when I opened my eyes, I realized it was coming from Arthur's room. It wasn't a beep or a buzz. It was him, sobbing. Not crying softly like before, but full-on gut-wrenching sobs, the kind you hear at funerals. I rushed into the room, flipped on the bedside lamp, and found him curled up like a child, both hands gripping the edge of his blanket so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Arthur?" I said, stepping closer. He didn't seem to hear me. His body shook as he gasped for breath between the cries. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't. She made me." His words trailed off into incoherent murmurs. I knelt beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead, trying to calm him down. His skin was clammy, feverish. I debated calling the doctor, but after several minutes, he quieted again. His breathing slowed. His grip on the blanket loosened. When I finally got him to open his eyes, he looked at me like I wasn't even there, like he was looking through me. "Do you see her, Grace?" he asked in a hoarse voice. I froze. "Who?" I whispered, barely able to get the word out. He didn't answer. He just shut his eyes again and turned his face away from me like a scolded child. The next morning, he had no memory of the incident, or at least that's what he claimed. When I asked him how he was feeling, he scowled and snapped at me for bringing him the wrong medication, even though it was the exact same dose he'd been taking for months. Margaret said she'd heard him too. That same night, she had been walking past his door and paused when she heard him scream. She said it sounded like he was fighting with someone, but we were the only ones in the house. Well, almost. There were times when I wondered if the mansion itself was feeding into this madness. The creaking floorboards, the groaning pipes, the way the walls seemed to whisper back when you stood still long enough. I caught myself jumping at shadows more than once, waking up from nightmares I couldn't remember, feeling watched in empty rooms. I blamed the stress, the exhaustion. 11 years of living in that house had taken its toll. Still, there was one night I'll never forget. I was walking past Arthur's door just after 2 a.m. headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. His door was slightly ajar, which was unusual because he was always paranoid about privacy, even when he slept. I slowed my steps, curiosity getting the better of me. That's when I heard him say it. At first, I wasn't sure what I was hearing. His voice was low, cracked, like he was talking through clenched teeth. But then the words became clear. "I buried her," he said. My heart stopped. I stood frozen in the hallway, barely daring to breathe. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then he spoke again, barely above a whisper. "Under the roses." My throat went dry. My palms turned cold. I took a step back, accidentally knocking my shoulder against the wall. The soft thud startled me more than it should have, and in a panic, I darted down the hall, back to my room, shutting the door quietly behind me. I spent the rest of the night sitting upright in bed, staring at my bedroom door, heart pounding like a drum. The next day, I tried to tell myself I'd misheard him, that he was dreaming, delirious, confusing reality with some long-buried memory or hallucination. After all, dementia could play cruel tricks on the mind. That had to be it. It had to be. But something deep inside me, something I couldn't explain, told me that whatever Arthur Langston was whispering about in the dead of night wasn't just the ramblings of an old, dying man. And by the end of that week, his condition took another sudden, sharp turn for the worse. The night Arthur Langston died felt different from the moment I woke up that morning. There was a stillness in the air that clung to the walls like damp fog. The kind of stillness you feel in the moments right before a thunderstorm breaks the sky open. Except this time, there were no clouds, no wind, no warning of any kind. Just silence. Margaret didn't come in that day. She'd called early in the morning, her voice scratchy and tired, saying she wasn't feeling well. Carl, the groundskeeper, hadn't shown up either. It was just me and Arthur in that big, cold mansion. The emptiness settled over the rooms like a thick blanket, muffling every sound. Arthur's condition had been worsening for weeks, but that day, it was like watching a clock run out of time. His skin had taken on a pale, waxy tone. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his lips had turned a faint shade of blue. His breathing was shallow, coming in short, labored bursts, each one sounding more painful than the last. Even the machines surrounding him, the oxygen concentrator, the heart monitor, seemed to beep softer, as if they knew their job was almost done. I stayed by his side, going through the motions like I had so many times before, checking his IV, adjusting the oxygen mask, dabbing a cool cloth on his forehead. But underneath all that, I was shaking. I wasn't scared of losing him. I'd made my peace with that reality months ago. What terrified me was the way he kept looking at me, like he wanted to say something but couldn't, like there was a weight on his chest heavier than the heart failure slowly killing him. By late afternoon, the house was cloaked in shadows. I remember glancing out the window at the rose garden. The blooms were in full color, vibrant reds and soft pinks glowing under the fading sun. The same roses he insisted on tending to, even when he could barely walk. I thought about the words I'd overheard a few nights before, the ones I tried to convince myself I'd imagined. I buried her, under the roses. It repeated in my mind like a broken record, but every time it surfaced, I shoved it back down. Arthur was confused, sick, hallucinating. That had to be the explanation. Around 8 o'clock, I called Dr. Patel, his primary care physician, giving her a quick update on his condition. She told me what I already knew: keep him comfortable, monitor his vitals, and call hospice if things took a sudden turn. Her voice sounded tired, detached, like she'd already written him off. By midnight, I was sitting in the chair beside his bed, holding his frail, cold hand. The heart monitor showed an erratic pattern, spikes and drops, long pauses between beats that made me hold my breath every time. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp on the far side, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like reaching hands. Arthur drifted in and out of consciousness, his eyelids fluttering, his mouth moving but no sound coming out. I leaned in close. "Do you want water?" I asked softly. His lips barely moved, but he shook his head. Instead, he gripped my hand tighter. tighter than I thought possible for someone as weak as he was. And then, it happened. Out of nowhere, with a sudden burst of strength that sent chills down my spine, he yanked me closer. His eyes flew open wide, glassy and full of something I can only describe as pure, undiluted fear. His fingers dug into my wrist, sharp and trembling. I barely had time to react before he pulled me so close that I could feel the hot, sour breath from his mouth against my cheek. "I buried her," he whispered, voice raw and cracking like a dried branch about to snap. Under the roses." My heart stopped. For a split second, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His grip tightened even more. "Tell no one," he gasped, the words coming out like a death rattle. "Or you'll end up like her." Time froze. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The air around us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. I pulled back instinctively, but he wouldn't let go. His knuckles turned white as his fingers stayed locked around my wrist. For those few seconds, he didn't look like Arthur Langston, the wealthy oil tycoon who bullied and manipulated everyone around him. He looked like a man terrified of his own secrets. A man haunted by something so vile, so unforgivable, that he carried it all the way to the edge of death. I wanted to say something, to ask him who, to scream at him for more details, but my throat locked up. My mind went blank. Then, just as suddenly as it started, his grip loosened. His hand fell back onto the bed like dead weight. The heart monitor let out one long, continuous beep. Flatline. I froze, staring at the screen. The green line that once danced with life now stretched straight across, unmoving. For a moment, I thought he might jolt back, that it was another one of his tricks. Arthur had always been dramatic, manipulative, prone to games that left me second-guessing reality. But this wasn't a game. I reached for the stethoscope, pressing it against his chest, hoping, praying, for even the faintest sound of life. There was nothing. No heartbeat, no breath, just silence. The house felt colder than it ever had before. I sat there, stunned, staring at his lifeless face. His eyes were half open, staring blankly at the ceiling like they had so many nights before. But now, there was no awareness, no fear, no hatred, just emptiness. A part of me expected to cry. After all, I'd spent more than a decade taking care of this man. But there were no tears, only this strange sinking sensation in my stomach, like something had shifted permanently in the air around me. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky and weak beneath me. I walked over to the monitor and silenced the flatline alarm, the room falling into an eerie stillness once again. As I stood there, the weight of his last words crashed over me like a tidal wave. "I buried her, under the roses. Tell no one, or you'll end up like her." I turned my head toward the window. The garden was barely visible under the moonlight, but I could still make out the dark silhouettes of the rose bushes swaying in the night breeze. My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if it could be heard echoing through the empty halls. I didn't know who her was. I didn't know if what I heard was even real. But one thing was certain. Arthur Langston had taken his last breath and left me with a secret I could never unhear. And in that moment, standing there in the dim light with the smell of antiseptic and fading life around me, I knew my life had just changed forever. The morning after Arthur Langston died, the mansion felt like a hollow shell. The rooms, always too big and too cold, somehow felt even more cavernous now. The silence wasn't the usual kind, the oppressive, heavy quiet that came from a man who hated noise and hated people even more. It was different. It was the kind of silence that settles after something terrible happens, and everyone's too scared to speak about it. I stood in the hallway outside his room for what felt like hours, staring at the door as if it might open again, as if he might call for me, yelling my name with that scratchy, spiteful voice. But there was nothing. Just the faint creak of the old floorboards under my feet and the low hum of the refrigerator from the distant kitchen. The coroner came and went. The hospice nurse arrived shortly after, did her paperwork, and offered me the same hollow condolences she probably gave to a dozen other grieving families that week. I nodded and signed where I needed to sign, my mind barely processing a word of what she said. By mid-afternoon, the house was empty again. No staff, no doctors, no visitors. Just me and the weight of what Arthur had whispered to me hours before his heart finally gave out. I buried her, under the roses. Tell no one, or you'll end up like her. The words repeated in my head, over and over, like a song stuck on loop. No matter how hard I tried to distract myself, by cleaning the kitchen, folding laundry, reorganizing the medicine cabinet, I couldn't escape them. Eventually, I found myself walking outside. I didn't even realize where I was headed until I reached the edge of the rose garden. For years, that garden had been just another part of the property. Pretty enough, I guess, though I never paid it much attention. It was Arthur's sanctuary, not mine. Even on his worst days, when he could barely lift his head, he'd insist on being wheeled outside to sit among the roses. Sometimes he'd just stare at them for hours. Other times he'd mutter things to himself as he watched Carl prune the bushes with meticulous care. Now, standing there with the winter sun low in the sky, the garden looked different, threatening. The air smelled too sweet, sickeningly sweet, like the perfume of something trying too hard to mask rot underneath. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake the chill crawling down my spine. The soil? I couldn't stop staring at it. The neat rows of rose bushes, the way the dirt looked freshly turned in some places, though Carl hadn't been out here for days. My mind started pulling memories to the surface. All those times I'd walked past this spot on my way to take out the trash or bring in groceries. All those afternoons when Arthur sat silently, his eyes distant, his face drawn and pale. I thought back to one summer afternoon, maybe 5 years ago. Arthur had been in a particularly foul mood that day, snapping at Margaret, cursing at me for bringing him the wrong blanket, even yelling at Carl over how he trimmed one of the bushes too short. At the time, I'd chalked it up to his usual cruelty. But now I wondered if it had been something else. Something closer to panic or guilt. My stomach twisted. I took a step closer to the nearest bush, kneeling down to run my fingers through the soil. It felt loose, softer than it should have, considering the cold season. I pulled my hand back quickly, wiping the dirt on my pants like it had burned me. This was ridiculous. He was delirious, hallucinating, his brain shutting down after years of heart failure and stress and God knows what else. Old people said strange things on their deathbeds all the time, didn't they? But even as I tried to rationalize it, the memory of his grip, how strong it had been in that final moment, sent a wave of nausea rolling through me. Tell no one, or you'll end up like her. The threat hadn't been whispered like the confession before it. It had been clear, intentional, and full of that same venom he used whenever he wanted to make sure you didn't forget something. I stood up and took a step back from the rose bushes, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Should I call the police? The thought hit me like a slap, and just as quickly I shook my head. What would I even say? That my dying employer mumbled something cryptic about burying someone in the garden. They'd laugh me off the phone. Or worse, they'd show up, dig up the whole place, find nothing, and label me as some hysterical, overworked nurse losing her grip after a patient's death. And what if he really had been hallucinating? The last thing I needed was a scandal dragging me through the mud for accusing a dead man of what? Murder? I sat down on the stone bench near the back of the garden, putting my head in my hands. For a few minutes, I just sat there, breathing, trying to steady myself. Then, without thinking, I pulled out my phone and opened a search engine. I typed in her name, Evelyn Langston. It was the first time I'd allowed myself to look her up. I scrolled through old news articles, grainy photos from over a decade ago, headlines screaming her disappearance, the desperate press conferences, Arthur sitting in front of flashing cameras, pretending to weep, begging for her return. I didn't know Evelyn personally. I started working for Arthur 3 years after she disappeared, but I'd heard the rumors. Everyone had. The story was that she'd run away after some explosive fight with her father. There were whispers that she'd taken off to Europe with a boyfriend, maybe changed her name, started a new life somewhere far away. But there were always those who doubted. Some said she wouldn't have left without saying goodbye to certain friends. Others claimed she'd been planning something big, a public confrontation about Arthur's business dealings, but then she vanished overnight. I never connected the dots before. Until now, a fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. I locked my phone and shoved it deep into my pocket. No, I couldn't do this. Not now. Not yet. Fear pressed heavy on my chest, the kind that makes your limbs feel weak and your thoughts blur at the edges. I imagined myself making that call to the police. Imagined them showing up with their sirens, their questions, their endless reports. And I imagined what would happen if I was wrong. What would that do to my career? To my life? To Arthur's estate? Margaret and Carl would be dragged into it too. Reporters would swarm the house. My name would be everywhere. But the alternative, doing nothing, wasn't sitting right with me either. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned in my tiny bedroom upstairs, the mattress feeling harder than usual, the air too dry despite the humidifier running by my bedside. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the rose garden. I saw dirt being shoveled away, revealing pale fingers curled around roots. I heard Arthur's voice again, rasping in my ear like he was still lying in that bed, refusing to die quietly. By 3 a.m, I found myself standing at my window, looking down at the garden. The moon cast long shadows across the bushes, making the ground look uneven, disturbed. I hugged myself tight, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. Was it my imagination? Or was one of the bushes swaying, when there wasn't even a breeze? I stayed there until the sun rose, my heart beating faster with every passing minute. By the time the first light of dawn painted the sky pink and gray, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever Arthur Langston had done, whatever secrets he'd taken to his grave, they weren't going to stay buried for long. By the 4th morning after Arthur's death, I reached my breaking point. The sleepless nights, the whispers that seemed to cling to the corners of every room, the way the rose garden loomed larger and darker every time I looked at it, I couldn't take it anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the soil shifting on its own. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. I jumped at my own reflection in the bathroom mirror. I kept telling myself it was grief, that the stress of 11 years living in this house under Arthur's cruelty had finally cracked something inside me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something, or someone, was out there beneath the roses. The final push came around 6 a.m. on that 4th day. I was pouring myself a cup of coffee in the kitchen when I glanced out the window. There, standing right in the center of the garden, was a lone blackbird. It stood perfectly still, perched on one of the larger rose bushes, staring straight at the house. The way it looked at me, it sent a chill through my whole body. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. I didn't even finish my coffee. Instead, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Adam's number. Adam Foster, an old friend from high school who ran a small landscaping business on the outskirts of town. We hadn't spoken in months, but I knew he'd help me without asking too many questions. When he answered, his voice was thick with sleep. "Grace? Wow. Long time. Everything okay?" I swallowed hard. Yeah, everything's fine. I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end. "I'm listening." "I need someone to help me aerate the rose garden," I said quickly, forcing the words out like I'd rehearsed them. "The soil's gotten too compacted. Arthur used to care about that stuff, and with the estate going up for sale soon, I figured it should look good for the listing photos." Another pause. "Grace, it's late fall. Not exactly peak gardening season." I laughed, nervous and forced. "I know. I'm trying to keep busy, you know? After everything." He sighed, then finally said, "All right, I'll bring the guys over this afternoon." By the time Adam's truck pulled up the long driveway around noon, I was pacing circles in the living room, my stomach in knots. 2 men climbed out with him, hauling shovels and soil aerators from the truck bed. They were laughing and joking like it was just another job. I watched from the window, chewing on my thumbnail until my gums ached. When Adam knocked on the door, I plastered on the best fake smile I could manage. "Hey," he said, pulling off his baseball cap. "Where do you want us to start?" I led them out to the garden, pointing toward the farthest section, near the eastern edge where the oldest rose bushes grew. "Over there," I said. "That patch seems the most neglected." Adam gave me a look. "You sure? That's the thickest area." I nodded, already feeling sweat gather at the back of my neck despite the crisp air. As the men got to work, I hovered nearby, pretending to pull weeds, though my hands shook too much to hold the small garden trowel properly. With each thrust of the shovel into the earth, my heart pounded harder. The first few layers were just loose soil and mulch, earthworms and roots, old leaves from seasons past. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Arthur standing at the window, watching me with that familiar look of disapproval, but the house remained still, empty, dead. Adam's guys chatted as they worked, making offhand comments about the size of the roots and how well the roses were growing despite the season. I forced myself to stay calm. It wasn't until they were almost 2 feet down that I heard one of them say, "Whoa, hold up." I froze. Adam walked over, frowning as he looked into the hole. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer, my pulse racing. The man who had been digging, Jeff, I think his name was, reached into the dirt and pulled out a scrap of fabric. Dark, soil-stained, but with an unmistakable texture. Silk. My throat closed up. "Looks like someone buried some old curtains or something," Jeff joked, shaking the dirt off the fabric. But when the second shovel hit something hard, the mood changed. The sound wasn't the dull thud of hitting a rock or tree root. It was hollow, brittle. I felt my stomach lurch. Adam crouched down, using his gloved hands to dig more carefully now. After a few minutes, more of the fabric emerged. And then something else. White. Smooth. I covered my mouth with both hands. It was bone. Small, delicate, unmistakably human. The laughter and casual banter vanished immediately. Jeff stepped back, his face draining of color. The other guy, Mark, muttered something under his breath and took several steps away from the hole. Adam stood up slowly, looking at me with wide eyes. "Grace, what the hell is this?" I couldn't speak. My knees buckled, and I sank down onto the grass, staring at the shallow grave as if my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Adam was already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the cops." I opened my mouth to protest, to stop him, but no words came out. As he stepped aside to make the call, I shifted closer to the edge of the hole, peering down through blurred vision. That's when I saw it. Nestled in the dirt, tangled between the decaying silk and cracked bones, was a small silver chain, half buried, but still intact enough to catch the faint glimmer of sunlight breaking through the trees. With trembling fingers, I reached for it, brushing the dirt away just enough to see the charm hanging at the end. An engraved name. Evelyn. The letters were faded but still legible. For a long moment, all I could do was stare at it. Evelyn Langston. Arthur's daughter. The missing girl from all those newspaper clippings. The girl with the sharp eyes and stubborn smile. The girl the world thought had run away to Europe all those years ago. I sat back on the cold grass, my hands trembling so violently that the necklace slipped from my fingers and fell back into the dirt. Everything around me blurred. The sound of Adam talking to the dispatcher faded into the background. Even the cold air on my face felt distant. All I could hear were Arthur's last words echoing in my mind. "I buried her. Under the roses. Tell no one, or you'll end up like her." For the first time in years, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was silence. As I sat on the back steps of the mansion, staring out at the rose garden now marked with yellow police tape, memories I hadn't thought about in years began flooding back, crashing into me with a force that left me breathless. Evelyn Langston. Her name felt like a forbidden word, one I had avoided saying out loud for as long as I worked here. Not because anyone told me not to, but because it always felt like opening a wound that never fully healed. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remember everything. 14 years ago, long before I ever stepped foot inside this house, Evelyn disappeared. I wasn't here when it happened, but by the time I was hired, her absence was already stitched into the walls like some kind of permanent scar. Even the staff who remained, Margaret and Carl, rarely mentioned her. If they did, it was in hushed tones, like speaking her name too loudly might stir something buried deep and dark. I remembered seeing the news footage when it all happened. The Langston name was everywhere. Local stations, national networks, front pages of newspapers. Arthur Langston, the grieving father. I could still picture him sitting on the front porch of this very house, cameras flashing in his face, his voice trembling as he begged for anyone with information to come forward. There were posters with Evelyn's picture stapled to telephone poles all over town. Her face, young, beautiful, full of life, became a permanent fixture in every grocery store window and gas station bulletin board. I had been 23 at the time, a fresh nursing school graduate, still working odd jobs to pay off my student loans. I remember watching one of those press conferences with my roommates, all of us shaking our heads, talking about how tragic it was, how terrifying. Back then, I never imagined I'd end up working for the man sitting on that screen. But now that I looked back on it all with new eyes, the cracks in the story were impossible to ignore. I thought about the first time I saw Arthur react to Evelyn's name. It was during my 3rd month on the job. A reporter had sent a letter asking for a follow-up interview for the 10-year anniversary of her disappearance. I opened the envelope, assuming it was just another fan letter or business correspondence. I made the mistake of reading the first line out loud in front of him. As we approached the 10-year mark since Evelyn Langston went missing, before I could finish the sentence, Arthur snatched the letter from my hands, crumpled it into a tight ball, and hurled it across the room. "Don't bring her up in this house again," he barked, his face turning a shade of red I'd never seen before. I stood there, frozen, unsure how to respond. That wasn't the only time. There were nights, late, restless nights, when I'd catch the faint smell of burning paper coming from his study. The door would always be closed, the curtains drawn. Once, I got curious enough to press my ear to the wood. I heard him moving around, dragging something heavy across the floor, and then the unmistakable sound of a match being struck. Margaret knew something too. I was sure of it. There was this one afternoon, about 6 years ago, when I walked into the kitchen and found her holding a framed photo of Evelyn. It must have been tucked away in one of the drawers because I had never seen it out before. Margaret stood there, her thumb tracing the edge of the glass like she was memorizing the face looking back at her. When she realized I was watching, she shoved the frame back in the drawer and changed the subject so fast it made my head spin. At the time, I told myself it wasn't my business, that some wounds were too personal to question. But now I wondered just how much Margaret had known all along. The more I let my mind wander, the more pieces of the puzzle began shifting into place. Arthur's late-night pacing, the way he insisted on being wheeled out to the garden on random nights, even in the middle of winter, sitting there for hours without saying a word. The locked room on the 2nd floor, always off limits, always kept sealed, like it held something unspeakable. I remembered one night in particular, about 4 years ago. It was just after midnight. I had gone downstairs to refill his water when I heard noises coming from the garden. I peeked out the window and saw Arthur standing there in his robe and slippers, no coat, shoveling dirt back into one of the garden beds with frantic, jerky movements. At the time, I thought he was just being eccentric, maybe drunk, maybe sleepwalking. I didn't think to ask questions. Now, I wished I had. Every memory twisted and turned inside me like broken glass. Every moment I'd written off as harmless or explainable now screamed at me with new meaning. And then there were the business trips, the ones he took right after Evelyn disappeared. I remembered hearing Margaret tell a neighbor once that Arthur had flown to Europe to look for his daughter. But when I checked the timeline against some old travel receipts I found while organizing his files, it didn't add up. He hadn't left the country for months after she vanished. His first trip abroad was nearly a year later. And yet, the newspapers printed photos of him standing at foreign train stations, talking to local police, holding Evelyn's picture. Looking back, it was all theater, a performance for the cameras, a lie, one that lasted for 14 years. I sat there, my hands shaking as I scrolled through old articles on my phone again. My stomach twisted at how convincing he'd been. The public saw a grieving father, the broken man desperate for answers. I saw a murderer, I pulled my knees to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. A part of me wanted to forget what I knew, to pretend I hadn't found that necklace, to act like none of this was real. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her name engraved in silver, Evelyn. I thought about her lying out there for all these years, buried under the roses while her father smiled for cameras and accepted sympathy from strangers. I thought about her friends, her mother, wherever she was, living with the pain of not knowing. I had a choice. I could stay silent, like Arthur warned me to, or I could do what I should have done the moment I saw that bone. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen for a long moment. My thumb hovered over the keypad. Every part of me screamed in protest. I imagined the chaos that would follow, the investigations, the media circus, the questions I didn't want to answer. But then, I thought of Evelyn again, and I dialed 911. The sirens broke the stillness of the morning like glass shattering on concrete. By the time the first squad car pulled up, I was already standing on the front porch, arms crossed tightly over my chest, my heart beating faster than I could control. 2 officers stepped out, their faces serious and unreadable. Moments later, another vehicle arrived, then another. Within 30 minutes, the entire front lawn was crawling with uniforms. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the perimeter of the rose garden, flapping slightly in the breeze like a grim warning to anyone thinking of stepping closer. Officers moved back and forth, sectioning off parts of the property, setting up makeshift barriers, marking spots with bright orange flags. They took photos, measured distances, collected samples. I stood frozen, watching it all unfold as if I wasn't really there, as if I was floating outside my own body. Detectives in plain clothes arrived next. They walked through the garden with clipboards and cameras, their voices low but urgent. I could hear snippets of their conversations, terms like human remains, unidentified female, time of death estimation. The words blurred together, overlapping with the pounding in my head. By noon, the media showed up. First, it was just one van with a small local news logo painted on the side. Then came the larger stations, the big networks with satellite dishes mounted on their trucks. Reporters scrambled to set up tripods, their microphones pointed toward the house, waiting for any officer willing to throw them a quote. The front gate, once reserved for visiting dignitaries and business partners, now became a holding pen for journalists and curious onlookers. Neighbors stood at the edge of their properties, whispering among themselves, pointing toward the mansion that had loomed quietly over the community for decades. I stayed inside, peeking out from behind the living room curtains, my stomach twisting tighter with every passing minute. Detective Miller was the first to speak with me, a tall woman with sharp features and a voice that sounded like she hadn't slept in days. She sat across from me in the formal sitting room, the same room where Arthur used to conduct business meetings and shout at stockbrokers over the phone. I told her everything. Well, almost everything. I left out the part about Arthur's final words. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready to hear those words spoken aloud again. Maybe I was afraid of how they'd sound coming from my own mouth. Instead, I told her how I found the remains, how Adam and his crew had been called in for garden maintenance, how we'd stumbled upon the body by accident. I described the necklace, the silk fabric, the shallow depth of the grave. Detective Miller listened, scribbling notes, asking careful, calculated questions. She didn't seem surprised when I mentioned the name engraved on the jewelry. They knew. Of course they knew. Within hours, news of the discovery had spread like wildfire. Every station was running the story on a loop. Human remains found at Langston Estate. By evening, someone leaked that the jewelry belonged to Evelyn Langston. Reporters camped outside the gate, shouting questions anytime someone came or went. "Grace, did you know about this? Were there signs he was dangerous? How long has the body been buried? Is it true she's been missing for over a decade?" I kept my head down, avoiding the windows whenever possible. I disconnected the landline, silenced my cell phone. Margaret, who had returned to gather her things, left quickly after the news broke. Carl vanished without saying goodbye. The house felt different now. Before, its walls had been heavy with secrets. Now, it felt like the secrets were spilling out, flooding every corner, leaving behind a kind of rot you could almost taste in the air. The police searched the entire property, every room, every closet, every locked door, including the second-floor room that had always been off-limits. They forced it open with a crowbar. I didn't go upstairs to see, but I overheard one officer saying it was filled with boxes of old documents, financial records, personal letters, photographs. Some of the paperwork was burned around the edges, but a lot of it was intact enough to read. The investigation moved quickly after that. It didn't take long for the forensic accountants to get involved. They found evidence of embezzlement, money laundering, offshore accounts that stretched across 3 different countries, fraudulent business deals that spanned decades, hidden bank accounts that even Arthur's closest associates hadn't known existed. The media latched onto every new discovery like vultures circling fresh carrion. Each day brought a new headline. Langston Empire built on lies and blood. Missing heiress confirmed dead. Remains found on family estate. Shocking financial crimes uncovered after Langston Patriarch's death. The faces of Evelyn and Arthur appeared on every television screen. News anchors dissected every piece of the story, speculating on motives, interviewing former employees, digging up old footage from Evelyn's childhood, playing clips of Arthur's tearful press conferences from years ago. I couldn't escape it. Strangers started recognizing me in public. On my one trip to the grocery store, a woman stopped me by the freezer aisle, grabbing my arm and asking, "Is it true? Was she really there all this time?" I left my cart in the middle of the store and walked out without saying a word. Reporters began leaving notes at the front door. Some slipped letters under the gate. One particularly persistent journalist managed to get past the property line and knocked on the back door, asking for an exclusive interview. I slammed the door in his face and called the police to remove him. Still, they kept coming. The worst part wasn't the reporters or the headlines. It was the guilt. The heavy, smothering guilt that sat on my chest every night as I lay awake in bed. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. Should I have seen it sooner? Could I have done something years ago? Were there signs I ignored? Because it was easier to look the other way? I thought back to every moment I had doubted my instincts. Every time I told myself it wasn't my place to ask questions. Every time I watched Arthur's anger boil over and convinced myself that it was just the behavior of a bitter, lonely old man. But it wasn't just bitterness. It was something darker, something monstrous. And I had lived alongside it for over a decade. In the days that followed, the mansion emptied out. Police packed up their evidence, loading boxes into unmarked vans. The estate lawyers arrived soon after, speaking in low voices about probate court and asset liquidation. Arthur's empire, the fortune he had spent a lifetime building, crumbled in less than a week. By the time I began packing my own things, the house felt more like a museum of failure than a home. I stood in the middle of my bedroom, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag, glancing around at the few personal items I had allowed myself to keep over the years. A framed photo of my mother, a stack of dog-eared nursing textbooks, a small porcelain lamp I bought from a thrift store during my first month working here. I hesitated when I reached for my nursing license, which sat in a cracked frame on my nightstand. For a long moment, I just stared at it. 11 years. 11 years of night shifts, emergency calls, medication charts, and wound care. But this wasn't something I could recover from. I reached behind the frame and pulled out the paper certificate, folding it carefully and placing it at the bottom of my bag. I was done. With this house. With this job. With this chapter of my life. As I zipped the bag closed and grabbed my coat, I paused at the front door, taking one last look back at the empty hallway. Arthur's voice didn't echo through the walls anymore, but the weight of his lies lingered. And as I stepped outside, crossing the threshold for the final time, I knew I wasn't just walking away from the Langston estate. I was walking away from nursing for good. It's been almost 8 months since the day they pulled Evelyn's remains from under the rose garden. 8 months since the reporters packed up their cameras and left, since the Langston estate was stripped bare by investigators, since I loaded my belongings into the back of my car and drove away without looking back. I don't work as a nurse anymore. I don't think I ever will again. These days, I spend my time with a local volunteer group that focuses on missing persons cases. It's strange how life steers you toward places you never imagined going. I fill out paperwork for families, help distribute flyers, organize search efforts, and sometimes just sit with people who are drowning in the not knowing. Mothers, fathers, siblings, spouses. They come to us broken, desperate for answers, for closure. And every time I sit across from one of them, watching the way their hands shake or how their eyes go glassy from too many sleepless nights, I think of Evelyn. I think about all the nights she spent lying in that cold dirt, not even a stone to mark where she rested, while the world kept turning, while her father smiled for cameras and spun stories about her being in Europe. She stayed silent under layers of soil and lies. I see her face now more than I ever did before. Not just in the photos from the old newspaper clippings or the footage the media dug up during the investigation. No, I see her in flashes, in dreams, in quiet moments when I'm folding laundry or making coffee or staring at my bedroom ceiling at 3 a.m, and I still hear him. Arthur. His voice. That voice. It sneaks into my head when I least expect it, whispering the words he left me with in those final seconds of his life. Tell no one, or you'll end up like her. Some nights, I wake up gasping for air, convinced that I'm back in that house, sitting at his bedside, his hand crushing mine, his breath hot against my ear. I turn on every light in the apartment just to convince myself I'm not still there, but the fear lingers. It's like a stain I can't scrub out. I tell myself I made the right choice, that breaking my silence saved more people than I'll ever know, that exposing the truth about Arthur's crimes was necessary, that it gave Evelyn some semblance of justice, even if it came far too late. But when the nights stretch long and the city outside my window goes quiet, doubt creeps in. Was there more I could have done? Could I have saved her? Could I have noticed sooner? Should I have trusted my instincts back when the signs first appeared, years before I picked up that phone and called the police? I've had to sit through interviews with detectives, legal depositions, even counseling sessions arranged by victim support groups. They all tell me the same thing. I'm not responsible for what happened to her, but that doesn't make it easier. I still walk past missing person posters every day, faces of people gone for weeks, months, years. Sometimes I stop, run my fingers over the paper, whisper a silent promise that I'll help however I can. Some of the cases stay with me. There's a mother whose teenage son vanished after a party 2 towns over, a young woman who never returned from her morning jog, a father looking for his daughter, convinced she's still alive despite the odds stacked against him. And every time I sit with these people, I catch glimpses of myself in their faces. The same helplessness I felt every day I worked for Arthur Langston, knowing something was wrong, but not knowing just how deep the rot ran. I've tried to build a new routine. Volunteering fills the hours. There's comfort in staying busy, in putting my energy into something that might help someone else find the answers I never had the courage to seek for so long. But the nights are still the hardest. When the city noise fades and the walls close in, I lie awake and feel him there, like a shadow sitting at the edge of my bed. Tell no one, or you'll end up like her. The words curl around me, threading through my mind, turning sleep into a battlefield. Sometimes I wonder what Arthur would say if he knew I broke my silence, if he could see the police reports, the seized bank accounts, the way the Langston name became a punchline on late-night TV shows, if he knew his empire was crumbling, his legacy stained with scandal and death. Would he hate me? Would he laugh? Or would he finally, for once in his life, feel regret? I guess I'll never know. But I do know this. If I could go back, if I had the chance to do it all again, I'd make the same choice. I'd dig up the truth, because no one deserves to disappear without a trace. Now, I want to ask you something. If you were in my place, standing there in that garden, holding that silver necklace with Evelyn's name on it, would you have stayed quiet? Would you have buried the truth alongside her, knowing it would destroy everything? Or would you have done what I did, even knowing it meant tearing down an empire built on lies? I want to hear your thoughts. Really. Tell me, what would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments. Let me know if you think I made the right choice, or if you think I went too far. And if you want to hear more stories like this, true confessions, the kind people are too scared to tell out loud, make sure to subscribe, because trust me, I have more to say. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell us which country you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Leave a like and subscribe to keep listening to real stories and secrets from the elite. Click on the story on your screen. It may reveal more than you imagine.